you everyone for coming out. I'll just give a very brief introduction. We're very grateful to have Dr. Alice Rothschild with us today to give a discussion of the newest book. Dr. Rothschild is an activist, physician, author, and documentary filmmaker who has been working, residing, and making a difference in the Boston area for several years now. We're very grateful to have her here today. She's practiced in OBGYN medicine, she's taught medicine, and she's the author of not only a work, Broken Promises, Broken Dreams, but also the current On the Brink, which she'll be talking about today, in addition to a documentary film. So it's a distinct pleasure to welcome Dr. Rothschild. Please join me in welcoming her this time.
So thank you so much for inviting me. I'm going to do a little bit of introduction and conversation, and then some readings from my book, and then open this up for a Q&A. So just for some of my background, I started out in a very traditional Jewish family. I grew up in Sharon, Massachusetts. It's about an hour south of here. Went to Hebrew school, had a bat mitzvah, made a pilgrimage to Israel when I was a 14-year-old. So I came from a very traditional place. At the same time, I'm a child of the 60s, so I went to college and got more politically aware and politically active with the fighting the Vietnam War, and then went to medical school and discovered feminism and healthcare reform, and colonialism, imperialism, all those kinds of things. So my politics changed dramatically as an adult. And because of that, I couldn't mesh my childhood love of Israel with my adult politics. And it was something that was just, I didn't talk about it. If it was brought up at a family event, everybody started yelling at each other. It just wasn't productive. And then in the 1990s, I decided that I really needed to think about this and figure it out. And I started working with a group of other similarly sort of agonized political Jews, trying to figure out how we could understand the conflict. And we started a Jewish-Palestinian dialogue group, met with lefty Israelis, other Arabs in the Boston area, and had a rapid education about the area. And we were very excited by this, so we thought we should do public events and educate people. And then we discovered we were very quickly blacklisted. So we tried to figure out how we could work on this, and we thought, well, let's see if we can approach this through healthcare and human rights. And so in 2003, I started organizing annual delegations to Israel, Palestine, once we got to Gaza, and working with both people in the healthcare world, but also human rights, farmers, professors, teachers, all kinds of people, and really documenting what was going on that we weren't learning in our media here. And this led to my writing a book called Broken Promises, Broken Dreams, which was about not only my journey, but also the people who educated me, the Jews and the Palestinians who educated me. And then that led to making a documentary movie called Voices Across the Divide, which is a history of the conflict as told through the voices of Palestinians living in the United States, talking about their own personal histories. And then in June, I was there for 3 weeks, partly on a delegation, and partly exploring on my own. And I was blogging very compulsively, actually. And when I got home, this publisher called me and said, your blog should be a book. So this book is based on the blogs of 3 weeks in June, which was the run-up to the war. So it was just this really critical time. So I want to explain to you why I think it's important to read books like this. Since you're living in the US, you can see what kind of face of Israel there is in our media. So our media portrays Israel as modern democracy, it has some challenges, but it's got great culture and music and arts and all this sort of positive stuff. It's also, one of the biggest military powers. It's very high tech, and it's also a haven for Jews. This is the sort of mythos of the country. And what my book does is to try to really challenge this, what I call dominant paradigm. So as I said, I was in the region for 3 weeks, and what I want to do is sort of explore what I saw on the ground and have you think about what the mainstream narratives were. So when we got there, there was a hunger strike going on by Palestinian prisoners in administrative detention. It was the longest hunger strike that they've done. And we thought, this is going to be the big human rights issue. We're here to document this. And we thought that was what our focus was going to be. But shortly thereafter, 3 settler teams from Hebron were kidnapped. And suddenly that became the big hot issue. And it's very interesting to look at what happened, because the kidnapping unleashed this horrific barrage of military might, home incursions, and killings in the West Bank. And we saw Netanyahu immediately blaming Hamas, even though there was absolutely no evidence that Hamas had done this. And it was odd because we kept thinking the West Bank is crawling with Israeli Defense Force soldiers, it's crawling with Palestinian collaborators. I can't believe they don't know who did this. And so this sort of unleashed military might happened. 10 Palestinians were killed, 600 were arrested, including all of the Hamas leadership. And we also saw this sort of vitriolic incitement in Israel, very racist stuff being said about Arabs. Lefty Jews were being attacked on the streets. It was really frightening, and it was very clear that Netanyahu wanted to stop the unity government between Fatah and Hamas, and he was looking for an excuse, and he had either made the excuse or he had found it. And then 2 weeks after the teenage boys disappeared, and I always like to remind people that they were from a Jewish settlement in Hebron, which is a very racist, aggressive settlement. So you never should kidnap teenage boys, but they weren't coming from nice families. So 2 weeks after the initial incident, the bodies were so-called found, but we learned that the Israeli Defense Force had known they were dead either 1 or 2 days after they disappeared. But they kept it a secret because they wanted an excuse to invade the West Bank and do all this damage. So after that, there was the abduction and burning of a Palestinian teenager. This was clearly a revenge killing, but the Israeli police put out this rumor that he was gay and it was an honor killing. So it was really disgusting what was going on. And then the Palestinian American was beaten by an Israeli Defense Force soldier, and after he got out of the hospital, he was put under house arrest for no particular crime. And when he left, his family in Palestine was put under arrest and were harassed, also for the crime of being related to him. And then after that, East Jerusalem exploded. The Israeli police were using live fire, and then Hamas launched 30 rockets. It really raises the issue of provocation, what is resistance, all those kind of things. And then on July 7th, the Israelis attacked Gaza. And, it's important to remember that in a normal country, if 3 kids were kidnapped, there would be a criminal investigation, they would find the people who did it, there would be a trial. That's how normal countries behave. But in Israel, the abnormal has become normal. So if you look at why the Israelis went to war, originally it was to avenge the killings by Hamas, although Hamas hadn't done the killings. And then, with the barrage of rocket fire, it became, well, we have to go to war because of the rockets. We have to stop the rockets. And then it kept morphing, and I think you always have to worry about a war that keeps having a changing objective. So the next reason to go to war was to destroy the tunnels between Gaza and Israel. Now the interesting thing about that is that the Israelis knew about these tunnels long before this war. And the tunnels can be destroyed on the Israeli side. You don't have to invade Gaza to destroy tunnels. And in fact, that's how the Egyptians destroyed the tunnels between Egypt and Rafah. They did it on the Egypt side. They didn't invade Gaza to destroy the tunnels. So that's kind of a bogus reason. And then it became a massive collective punishment of all the civilians in Gaza, and a destruction of the infrastructure, targeting of both militants and civilians. And it's the 3rd time in 6 years this has happened. If you look at the UN numbers, there were 74 Israelis killed, 4 of them were civilians. In Gaza, there were over 2,100 people killed, 1,500 civilians, of those were 500 were children. And in Gaza, there were some 12,000 injured, over 100,000 made homeless, almost 500,000 without any water, over 200 schools damaged, 18,000 houses destroyed, 40,000 damaged. The numbers are just really horrific. It's estimated that there are 370,000 children in need of direct psychological support for the consequences of trauma and war. And if you look at the numbers about the munitions, it's really stunning. The Israelis dropped 20,000 tons of explosives on a strip of land 6 by 26 miles in 7 weeks. And Hamas and the militants managed to shoot 10 tons maximum. So the discrepancies are enormous. And then what was going on in Israel, there were 1,500 Palestinians with Israeli citizenship who were protesting the war, who were arrested, and 600 of them were indicted. There were Jewish humanitarian organizations like B'Tselem and Yesh Din that wanted to read the names of dead Gazan children on the radio, and the Israeli radio station refused. So they took this to the courts, and the courts denied them the right to read the names of the dead. So in Gaza now, there are children begging in the streets, and there's a new phenomenon of prostitution and boat people being smuggled out and attempting to reach Europe. In fact, I heard a human rights organizer say the main growth industry in Gaza right now is human smuggling. So I think it's important to understand both the larger context as well as the intimate details, to look at what kind of society is able to rally behind this kind of military aggression. Between 90 and 97% of Israelis supported the war, depending on what survey you look at. And also to look at what does occupation feel like, and what are the issues of Palestinian resistance. And when you do this, you see there's an incredible disconnect between myth and reality. So for me, using these blogs allows us to have a very in-depth snapshot. And these snapshots are really a metaphor for larger truths. So I'm going to start out just examining what are the consequences of being a Jewish state, and what are the consequences of having an immense amount of racism in that Jewish state. So I'm going to talk about a day in Jaffa. Jaffa is now attached to Tel Aviv, but it was an old Palestinian city. And we go on, hard to do this with 2 hands. We go on these alternative tours with a wonderful activist I'm going to tell you about. So we are back in what is often called 48 Israel, the Israel contained within the increasingly phantasmagorical Green Line, and we're meeting with one of my favorite academic activists, former city councilor Sami Abu Shahab. So he's giving us a tour of the city, and he says, the big deal happened in modern history the famous Jaffa orange export business. Apparently, some stroke of genius or luck led to the production of a thick-skinned orange that could be shipped anywhere, the Shamuti orange, carefully wrapped in special paper. So an enormous industry was created. The growers, the pickers, the wrappers, the guys who build the special boxes, the transport to the port, the boats, you get the picture. In the 1930s, 5 million boxes of oranges containing 400 million oranges passed through the port of Jaffa. So much for the Arabs' inability to make the desert bloom and their backward agricultural processes. So this all ended in the 1948 war, when Jaffa was largely depopulated of its Arab population. After the war, Israelis passed an aggressive program of Judaization, changing Arabic signage, destroying the old city, and disappearing the history and culture of the Palestinian majority that had existed for centuries. And then the Palestinians were both ghettoized into, they were rounded up and ghettoized, and then a process of gentrification started. So we continue the tour, and I write, this brings us back to the Palestinians of 1948 and the neighborhood of Ajami. In 1948, the remaining Palestinian inhabitants were rounded up and put into the neighborhood of Ajami. Their houses were declared neglected, and they were declared present absentees, or they kept their houses and had to share with incoming Jewish immigrants. Sami's great-grandfather was a soldier in the Ottoman army. He was not willing to be a refugee, so he stayed, was sent to Ajami, and lived surrounded by fences, soldiers, and dogs. Even the European Jews called it the ghetto. They should know. These refugees, 3,900 left out of a population of 120,000, experienced the dispossession of the Nakba and the loss of all friends, family possessions, libraries, teachers, doctors, hospitals, and language. What Sami calls the biggest armed robbery in the 20th century. They experienced the fact that if Israelis wanted cheap labor, Palestinians were present. But if Palestinians wanted their homes back, they were absent. This was a humiliating personal and economic loss that led to decades of depression, drug abuse, alcoholism, and criminality. In 1950, Jaffa was annexed to Tel Aviv, and since then it has been run by Jews and planned for Jews, quote, in this liberal democracy of Israel. So how does this segregation and racism look up close and personal? In the mixed cities, there are 3 kinds of schools: secular Jewish, religious Jewish, and Arab. Some 20 to 25% of Arabs go to secular Jewish schools, where the education is better, though completely Zionist. Jewish parents complained in one of these schools in Jaffa when the Arabs reached 50% of the student body. So the school divided itself into two schools, Arab and Jew. Then the parents demanded a wall down the middle of the playground. The municipality refused and used words like multiculturalism. So the Jewish parents took their kids out and sent them to schools in Tel Aviv, or to the right-wing national religious schools. The Israelis do not even seem to have the inclination or institutional or legal building blocks to build a multicultural society, let alone face the glaring endemic racism. It is late, and I'm too tired to continue. Let me just say that I knew I was in 48 Israel when I ordered a Turkish coffee, and a lovely cappuccino arrived. I didn't want to complain, so I grabbed the cinnamon, sprinkled the steamed foam liberally, only to discover that it was actually pepper. So I'm now going to take you to another city in Israel, Nazareth, and Nazareth Elite. And this is a tour we did with Jonathan Cook, who's an amazing journalist and activist in Nazareth. We are now heading to Nazareth Elite. The word means above, but also implies some moral superiority. The mayor erected some ginormous Israeli flags as a clear message that he intends to keep out the Arabs. Now this history is messy and confusing. The main points are that in the 1950s, our friend David Ben-Gurion announced the Judaization of the Galilee, with some comment to the effect, why so many Arabs? They were supposed to have been run out during the war. The focus was on Nazareth, the only successful, thriving Palestinian city that could potentially become a cultural and political force. So he confiscated thousands of acres of Nazareth and built a Jewish neighborhood and a resorption center for incoming Jewish refugees, while the Palestinians in the city below lived under military rule, and the Israeli Defense Forces built an army of Palestinian collaborators through various devious ways for the desperate population. The goals of Judaization are to contain, isolate, and fragment the Palestinian community. The next goal is to redirect resources from Palestinian citizens to Jewish citizens, so the imposing administrative offices were built on land confiscated from, guess who? This is right by a road also annexed to Nazareth Elite. The Israeli army annexed land as well, and the Fancy Plaza Hotel was built in Nazareth Elite to capture tourist dollars from Nazareth, which I will remind you is a very important religious site. Then there are the industrial areas also annexed to Nazareth Elite, including, unfortunately, a delicious chocolate factory. You get the pattern. The final goal was to build a system of surveillance on hilltops, which, let's just say, happened in spades. The Israeli legal system kicked in with a variety of laws and rulings that recognized only 124 of the 204 Palestinian villages still in Israel. They determined the blue lines for city expansion. Jewish towns get a lot, Palestinians get nothing beyond their 1965 boundaries. Communities can use what are called compatibility laws to keep out Arabs, and no one in the Jewish cities will sell to a Palestinian family. And the list goes on, and is quite disgusting, I must say, especially since we are talking about the only democracy in the Middle East. The mayor of Nazareth Elite, after describing Nazareth as a, quote, nest of terror, had difficulties attracting new residents. But he lucked out when 1 million Russians arrived looking for a place to live. Now immigration is at a standstill. Russians who want to get out of this less than desirable place are willing to sell to middle-class Palestinians who cannot find housing in Nazareth. The clever mayor, seeing that 20% of Nazareth Elite is now Arab, has morphed the absorption center into a Chesed Yeshiva, a center for Orthodox Torah study and military preparation. In other words, a real nest of terror, finally. Oh, and he's also invited right-wing settlers originally from Gaza and other West Bank settlements to move in. And for extra credit, he is building a neighborhood for 3,000 only for Haredim families, thus creating tension between the religious and the secular. So there are now modesty patrols, women attacked with acid, and shops burned, and we're not even in Tehran yet. This makes the modern Christian Palestinians with their short sleeves and tight jeans wonder if it is time to leave. While this all may seem a bit crazy, the important concept here is that this whole exercise is about Judaization, getting rid of the Palestinians and creating a Jewish state by any means necessary. And this is the fundamental flaw of Zionism as it is now practiced. This is not a sustainable model for Jews or for Palestinians, trying to make everything Jewish, whatever that means. And I would argue that most of what I have described is far from Jewish, but falls under topic headers like racist, prejudiced, Islamophobic, ignorant, etc., and is not what the richness and grand multiculturalism of life is all about. It is also not a good strategy to protect against anti-Semitism, which exists in the world. As Jonathan explains, quote, "It turns us into monsters. Nazareth and its big city, big sister, are just a microcosm of this growing national tragedy." So I'd like to take you now to the West Bank and East Jerusalem. And so I'm in East Jerusalem meeting with some folks from the World Health Organization. And as you know, I'm a physician, so I have a particular interest in that. So here we go. So this is a blog post entitled "Don't Get Sick While Palestinian." So this is my current understanding of a fragment of Palestinian healthcare. Take a deep breath and suspend any concepts you may harbor regarding the right to health. A Palestinian family calls an ambulance in East Jerusalem. The call goes to the Magen David Adom Israeli ambulance service, which is, by the way, bound by international agreements. If the MDA determines that this is a high-risk neighborhood, they demand a police escort and will not enter the area until the police arrive. If the police do not come, then the Red Crescent is called. But if the situation is determined to be too dangerous, depending on the location, the Palestinian Medical Relief Society, PMRS ambulance is called. But PMRS ambulances are housed in El Beira in the West Bank and must pass through checkpoints and inspections and cannot reliably enter East Jerusalem. West Bank Palestinian ambulance drivers must have permits to drive the ambulance and personal permits to enter East Jerusalem. The permits last 6 months, and they are often given with dates that do not entirely overlap. So there are months when the drivers are unable to work. Palestinians in need of critical care from the West Bank face huge barriers, often have to walk. Okay, imagine chest pain, leg fracture, bleeding wound, emaciation and weakness from cancer, and walking across checkpoints, or be transferred by gurney between two back-to-back ambulances at a checkpoint. I've seen this with vegetable produce. It can ruin a shipment of tomatoes, but human beings? A Palestinian living in East Jerusalem is covered under Israeli insurance, which does not pay for the Red Crescent ambulance, which is often the only one that is able to come. Thus, the ailing patient, should he or she survive, is also out 150 shekels for the crime of being sick while Palestinian in a racist society. Ambulances get to Jewish Israelis in an average of 7 minutes. And then they go on to talk about how if there's a motor vehicle accident in the West Bank, the pickup for the victims are dependent on the identity of the victims. The medical decisions are reportedly made by the Israeli health coordinator, but what we learn is that ultimately the decisions are made at the checkpoint by a young Israeli soldier. I am told that these 18 to 21-year-olds with large guns and no medical knowledge decide if a case is medically severe. Is there blood, burns? Is the woman in labor or just fat? The sister of a friend in labor with a real pregnancy, when faced with the obstacles at the checkpoint to Jerusalem, just gave up, turned around, and delivered in Ramallah rather than face the risk of a dangerous checkpoint delivery. Forgive me if I sound angry. It is stunning what one can learn just listening to healthcare providers and administrators chatting over a cup of thick Arabic coffee in an office in East Jerusalem. There are so many injustices, some imposed by occupation, racism, and fear, and some by internal dysfunction. There's a growing drug problem in East Jerusalem, think poverty, hopelessness, no police protection or functional court system, and dealers running out of an Israeli crime network, currently mostly young men on heroin. And there are 3 small NGOs working on drug rehabilitation. East Jerusalemites pay the same taxes as West Jerusalemites and get minimal to no municipal services. There's not enough garbage collection, few playgrounds. In Beit Hanina, a neighborhood in East Jerusalem, the water supply is connected to Ramallah, but the sewer is connected to the Israeli system. As one public health worker noted, this causes hypertension. I wonder if this qualifies as torture by sheer constant aggravation. So I want to talk a little bit more about the mechanics of occupation, because it's really important to understand sort of the dynamics of daily life, and it's still really hard to do this with one hand. Okay, so I'm going to be talking about Kalandia checkpoint. To give this a little context, according to official statistics, since September 2000, more than 1,400 Palestinian children have been killed by the Israeli military. This was before the Gaza war, which is equivalent to one child killed every 3 days, and some 6,000 injured in the past 13 years or so. I think a year of national mourning is in order, but this is a military occupation, and well, what can I say about who counts and who doesn't? Which brings us to some other realities of daily life. I was hoping to tell you more about the realities of occupation, in particular, traveling while occupied. I, and every Palestinian I know, dreads Kalandia checkpoint, the major checkpoint between Jerusalem and Ramallah. It is a chaotic, traffic-plagued military terminal with guard towers and concrete walls and grimy garbage and narrow turnstiles, and people waiting, waiting, waiting. Faces range from utter resignation and defeat to outright indignation and rage. I vary. There is a sign on entry that says in English and Arabic, "Please keep terminal clean." But the Hebrew reads, "Please keep order and cleanliness." Can't trust those frisky Arabs to stay in line. People queue in narrow chutes, 2 to 3 feet wide, with vertical floor-to-ceiling bars and an excruciatingly narrow turnstile that makes passage with luggage, shopping bags, or small children a humiliating joke. The turnstile is controlled by the Israeli security, and I note that even the green light does not necessarily mean the bars will turn. Once in the maze, bags are x-rayed and I walk through the metal detector. Sometimes in protest, I do not take off my watch, and the metal detector buzzes, and no one cares. Sometimes they do. I then approach a bulletproof window where I press my passport up against the glass, and sometimes get the attention of a 20-something in uniform on the other side. Sometimes not. There's always a cup of coffee, or a phone call, or communication is challenging. 2 members of our delegation were pulled aside for extra security investigation, and were asked questions like, do you love Israel? Are you afraid of us? Are you sure you're not an Israeli citizen? This woman's name was Malka. She was stopped everywhere for that reason. Do you love Palestinians? Really? Then there are more turnstiles of the humiliation you are a rat in a cage and we really control you, in case you did not already get the message variety. And then you are free to fight for a taxi, or a bus, or a service with a license plate appropriate for whichever side you're on. On the other side, I note a sign in Arabic that says Judea and Samaria, in case you're not clear on the concept. My recollection is that there's a sign in English that says, have a good day, or some such thing. So I was thinking, if I were bent on revenge, or strapped in a suicide vest, this is all about security, right? Would I really hazard a visit through Kalandia? I think not. So what is this massive, time-consuming, demoralizing daily exercise about? Control and humiliation comes to mind. Also, it might just be easier to stay home and skip that visit to Al-Aqsa this year, if one were lucky enough to get a permit in the first place. So I'm going to take you now to a refugee camp, because I think refugees are central to this issue. And this is a blog posting called The Main Course. The Balata refugee camp in Nablus is a concrete maze of twisting, narrow, sometimes shoulder-width paths, 2 main streets for the schools and the markets, and a jumble of houses leaning towards each other at odd angles, obliterating the sunshine as the residents search for non-existent space for growing families and multiple generations. The camp started in 1950 with a lease from the town of Balata for 1 square kilometer of land for 5,000 refugees, mostly from Jaffa from the 1948 war. The United Nations set up tents that turned into tiny, cramped one-room houses, and finally, this jumble of construction. Sewer and water arrived in the 1960s. The houses are dark, small, usually families are large and multi-generational. The area is fairly stark, wires dangle between buildings, and the rare geranium. Bright graffiti adorns some walls, and Japanese artists have painted a kaleidoscope of flowers near the girls' school. So, let's stop a minute. 10 years without sewer and water? There's no privacy within or between houses. There's no more room to build, forget green space and playgrounds. There's massive unemployment, estimated at 56% in a population of 30,000, and little hope or opportunity. It is hard to escape this environment, so people live their lives, marry their sweethearts, have families, take care of each other, and struggle from day to day. If you have the misfortune to suffer from a heart attack, or ruptured appendix, or a bleeding pregnancy, you have to be carried. I'm not talking on a gurney here, down these twisted concrete paths, often turning sharply angled corners, the stone surface is irregular and rocky, to get to an ambulance. If you are dead, the corpse sometimes is hoisted roof to roof across houses to get to a wider street. If you are in a wheelchair, if you're trying to bring in some newly bought furniture, if you're having a seizure or a stroke, the hurdles are unimaginable. Remember this the next time someone discussing the, quote, peace process says nonchalantly, oh, the refugees are off the table. The refugees are actually the main course. You can imagine why Balada was one of the leaders of the two intifadas. Even the dead are angry. We sit around the long, oblong table, and Mahmoud breaks into an engaging, warm smile. He is a successful son of Balada. Born in the camps, he received an excellent education from the UN schools, and as the oldest child went on to higher education in Birzeit University, and studied and worked all over the world, including the US. His siblings are high-level professionals. He presents us with a very worrisome report that mirrors our discussion the last time he spoke to our delegation. Years of Palestinian dehumanization and resistance and Israeli retaliation, thousands injured, dead, imprisoned, generations of children traumatized by violence, and the frequent experience of Israeli soldiers, tanks, artillery, and Apache helicopters. Mahmoud is not optimistic. In Balada, quote, life is a war. The children who are out of school for months during curfews during the second intifada are the teenagers who are now illiterate, violent, and difficult to engage. Mahmoud runs programs for youth, music, arts, crafts, computers, film, photography, psychosocial support. He sees the depression, the rising drug use, and the suicidality. Boys walk unarmed into Jewish settlements, hoping to be killed and martyred. He knows that especially with boys aged 10 to 15, 50% of ninth graders are illiterate and cannot even write their names. The girls do better. They are more protected, have less exposure to the street, and in general are more focused, resilient, and studious. And then those folks who actually get employed barely make a minimum wage. Most people in Balada are becoming vegetarians. 1 kilogram of meat costs 50 shekels. Many men work all day for 40. So who is going to buy meat? Mahmoud worries about the future. He is more optimistic about women, their strengths, focus, and perseverance. He urges us to educate our communities in the US, to vote and pressure our governments. Quote, we do not hate Jewish people. We want justice and peace for everyone. The voices of reason all are losing the ground. So I'm going to close with a blog posting that is called Who is the Terrorist? Let's just say Bani Naim is a large Muslim village of 20,000 east of the city of Hebron, a region known for large stone quarries and miles of vineyards. I have been visiting an extended family where most everyone is well educated, teachers, businessmen, doctors, people with degrees in education who cannot find employment and, quote, jump the wall to find work in Israel, or to get visas to do graduate work in the US, or do online PhD programs in Islamic religion and Quranic studies. Families tend to be large, babies tend to be loved and plentiful. It seems that everyone we meet is related. Their idea of a good time is sitting on a balcony with each other at sunset, drinking Turkish coffee, eating sweets, talking, and smoking nargila. The main issue with the view, besides the stone quarry, is the Israeli military base in the distance and the spy balloon that hangs above the hills over the fanatically racist Jewish settlement of Kiryat Arba. The houses I visit are beautiful, meandering white stone Arab homes surrounded by patches of olive, almond, lemon, fig, and apple trees, gardens with water-starved flowers and aromatic bushes like lavender that just burst with aromatic perfume when the sun sets. The love of the land and its bounty is palpable. Far from the center of town, there's a larger field with a greenhouse where I see rows of happy ulachia that gets concocted into this great green soup with rice, and a field of wheat. Much has been passed down to the generations. The living rooms of these houses have big screen TVs, and often some totally discordant American cowboy movie with Arabic subtitles, or an overly dramatic soap opera from Saudi Arabia playing in the background. It is stunningly hot, and periodically someone talks about the 4 feet of snow that fell last winter and paralyzed the village. The land is hilly, with single homes here and there. Throw in some goat herds and minarets, and if you keep looking, you can see the Dead Sea and the purple hills of Jordan. It is all pretty spectacular. This is the kind of family that warmly welcomes me into their home. The mother has prepared a ginormous meal of extraordinarily good food, which is made of rice and chicken and stuffed grape leaves and stuffed zucchini and yogurt and spices to die for. Everyone is behaving as if I have not eaten in days. So after some talk, my host suggests that the family watch my documentary on the Nakba, Voices Across the Divide. And I wonder, how will that play? A documentary produced by a secular Jewish woman for a US audience, sharing the Palestinian story in a room full of devout Muslims. Is this chutzpah or foolishness? And so we talk, and I say they have to be honest with me. Everyone wants to see it. And so they invite over more relatives, and soon everyone is glued to the TV, and we're not watching Bonanza. I'm a bit freaked out, since they keep talking, and I can't tell if this is good or bad. But it turns out this is a totally enmeshed, talkative family, and they're just having a big group experience. When the documentary ends, I hold my breath, and then the father speaks and says, the film is an excellent portrayal of the Palestinian experience, and then everyone chimes in, and we have this amazing discussion about all of their stories, and the making of the film, and the American Jewish community, and Zionism, Islam. As you may imagine, this is pretty stunning, a pretty stunning cross-cultural experience, and I'm so relieved. I feel embraced and welcomed despite my clear differentness. Perhaps I need more tea, and how about some nuts? So why am I telling you this story? When you hear a news report, these are the they, the Muslim other, the Palestinian militants near Hebron, the faceless families that are being terrorized by Israeli soldiers every night since the 3 boys, or settlers, or soldiers, or who knows what, or all of the above, disappeared. The day after the disappearance, the Islamic Center and School for Boys next door was ransacked by Israeli soldiers, and the imam was detained for a few hours and then released. After our movie night, and the sunset over Kiryat Arba, as we prepare for bed, I'm informed that the Israeli Defense Forces have attacked the town. They are at all the entries and have started going house to house. The village has a Facebook page which is suddenly the focus of everyone's attention. Someone reports that 3 to 4 buses of fully armed soldiers are walking through the town. Some take control of one house and put a sniper on the roof. TV News is talking about an IDF attack on Rafah, the southern border of Gaza. The electricity flickers on and off. Why? The family is anxiously awake until the middle of the night, tracking the soldiers on Facebook and on a local radio program. The father finally goes to the mosque to pray when the Muslim calls at 4 a.m., and then he comes home and goes to sleep. I learned that like many Palestinian men, he has been arrested twice and was in administrative detention for 2 months and released without any charges. He has obvious reasons to be anxious. He is a Palestinian male while Muslim, which is an arrest category in itself. No arrests are made here during the night, but everyone's nerves are a bit shattered and no one sleeps well. The youngest son is curled across his mattress and is in a deep stupor. I wonder how this all impacts him and his sense of safety, his belief in his parents' ability to protect him. The press is reporting hundreds of arrests, many more injured, and a steady number of killings. Hamas members, including legislators, are clearly targeted. Earlier, we passed one of the big "Bring Back Our Boys" signs. They were all over. It hits me that this is supposed to resonate with the violent kidnapping of girls in Nigeria. I try to imagine a society where that slogan would mean all of our boys, not only the 3 snatched last week, but the thousands of mostly boys and young men lost in Israeli detention centers, without parents or lawyers or the legal and human rights protections of any decent society. And then there are all those boys who have lost their humanity, breaking into houses night after night, terrorizing families, turning into frightened, dehumanized monsters. And I realize we need to bring them back as well. So, I'm going to stop now and open it up. Questions, comments, concerns? Yes.
So I just wanted to ask, you mentioned something about that caught my attention, and it might be a very, very basic question, but when you were talking about how, when there's some kind of emergency that happens and Palestinian families then call the ambulatory system, and you said something about how if it's high risk, the Israelis will then determine whether or not they send the PMRS in or if they themselves go ahead and do it. Can you, from your experience, define what high risk actually is, and from, I guess, the Israeli perspective as well?
So I actually didn't ask the people I was talking with what that meant, but I assumed that the Israeli forces or the ambulance forces or whatever decide if they think that they're at risk for have stones thrown or something of that nature. I mean, I think they're worrying about the safety of the ambulance drivers, is I think how they define high risk. The ambulances, the whole ambulance issue has gotten very politicized, obviously. So I think that's what they meant by that.
You said that they would ask people, like, do you love Israel, do you love Palestine, and what is a good answer to that? Like, how do you answer that?
This is, it's an excellent question, because if you go through a lot of Israeli security, you get asked the most ridiculous questions. I mean, in the airport, I have the experience of I call, are you good enough Jew questions, like they'll ask me, what's the name of my rabbi, if my children go to Hebrew school, name 5 Jewish holidays. I mean, it's a ridiculous kind of question. So, my understanding when you put it all together and you read UN reports, you read reports from, there's an Israeli group called Maxim Watch that monitors checkpoints and documents, that this has nothing to do with security. This is all about harassment. So it's all about harassment. It's all about making you not want to come back or not want to go through this checkpoint. So that's what it's about. It has nothing to do with security. And if an Israeli soldier with a big gun says, do you love Israel? What are you going to say? So I mean, they're in a position of power. So they're just letting you know, you're being watched. Yeah, and it has an effect. Like even though I'm 65 years old, I have a Jewish face, I have a Jewish name. Theoretically, I should not have a problem getting in. Every single time I go, I'm like an anxious wreck because I don't know if this time they're going to turn me away. That's the effect of that. And for Palestinians, it's infinitely worse because first of all, you have to get a permit. And if you get the permit, you still don't know when you're going to get through the checkpoint, and you don't know how long it's going to take. So that means that any time you want to go from point A to point B, you don't know if you're going to get there, and you don't know how long it's going to take, which is a ridiculous way to live your life. But it means, if you knew it was 2 hours at the checkpoint, then you leave 2 hours early and you get to work on time. But sometimes it's 2 hours, and sometimes it's 1 minute, and sometimes it's 4 hours. So if it's unpredictable, then the Israelis have total control. And that's what this is about. And that's what's so distressing when you start documenting sort of the nitty-gritty of what it means to be under occupation. It's really quite ugly.
Okay, I have a comment. At the beginning you said the whole thing started with the abduction of the 3 teenagers from the settlement, right? And as I have understood it from other sources, that it was actually started by the snipers taking out 2 Palestinian teenagers before that. So anyway, that's another. But to me, somebody could be saying, well, look, we are a civilized society in Israel. Look at you. You come in, you criticize it, you get out, you are working against us. So what do you say to that?
So people saying that about me?
Yeah, it's like you are a living testimony of how incredible the society is in Israel.
So that's a very important question, because I'm not an Israeli. And for me, one of the problems is that the Israeli government says that it speaks for all Jews of the world. But in my brain, I'm an American citizen and I'm a Jewish American. And Israel doesn't speak for me. So I don't represent Israel. I come from a Jewish tradition, I have Orthodox grandparents, I'm very involved in the culture, and that's what I'm attached to, and I'm part of the diaspora. And I think it's very important to separate Jewish from Israel, and it's something that is very hard to do because of the way the country presents itself, but it's something that Jews in the diaspora are increasingly asking for and demanding. And if you look at polls of how much Jews in America are attached to Israel, care about Israel, love Israel, and all that kind of stuff, 65 and over, it's like 100% except for a few people like me. If you get to like 35, less than half of people have any interest in Israel, and a lot of people are sympathetic to Palestinian solidarity. And so what I hear a lot of younger Jews saying is Zionism hijacked Judaism. Judaism is a religion, it's a cultural group, it's all those kind of things, but it's not Zionism. That's a political national movement. And that for us to have an intelligent conversation about this, we have to separate Judaism from Zionism, from the country of Israel, which is a country. It's not, some magical thing. It's a country, and it has to be held accountable as a country. So I think it's important to make those distinctions.
For me, I'm from Syria, and we always have that clear, that people of the religion, people of the book, we always call them people of the book. They had pride, they are different when the Zionists do. That was very clear. What I'm saying is, it just because of the Israeli mentality, like you said, that they are speaking for all of the Jews in the world, that this is how they present themselves. Now, the next question would be, how would you help other American Jewish? Because in this country, the support of Israel is, enabling Israel to do whatever they want to, right?
So, another excellent question. So, I see as part of my responsibility as a Jewish person to, first of all, educate people about what the realities of occupation really look like. And that's why I write books, and I make movies, and I talk all the time, and that kind of thing. So education is the first thing that's needed in our community, because people just really don't know in a way that's, I call it willful ignorance. Like, you can know, if you get on the internet, you can know in about 5 minutes. So it's a kind of willful ignorance, because no one wants to be a bad person. No one wants to be on the wrong side of history. Every group thinks of themselves as good people, and Jews are just the same. So this is a very painful journey for most Jews, because you have to sort of give up things that you thought you knew. So there's that sort of educational, cultural, psychological work that needs to be done. And then there's political work. So in the Jewish community now, there are a lot of activist Jews that belong to a group called Jewish Voice for Peace, which is a national group that's working very hard to change the dynamic here and working for boycott, divestment, sanction, and this kind of stuff. So there are activist groups that Jews belong to. And we're also seeing sort of cracks in the foundations. So like last week, there was a conference called the Open Hillel Conference. Did you hear of that? So Hillel is a Jewish organization that's on campuses, and it's an international organization, and it's supposed to provide a Jewish home for Jewish students on campuses. They can get kosher food, they can celebrate holidays, they can meet other Jewish people to fall in love with, whatever happens in Hillel. So, and when it started out, it was not a Zionist organization, because Zionism at the beginning was very controversial. But over the years, it's become basically an Israel advocacy group. So what happened was that the International Hillel Group produced a set of guidelines, and they said, you know, in Hillel, you cannot have any speakers who support boycott, divestment, and sanction. You cannot talk about right of return. You cannot talk about one state. And there were rules. And there are a lot of right-wing organizations like Campus Watch, Stand With Us, David Project, that are monitoring the discourse in the media and then muzzling and attacking people. So, you know, this was muddling along, we're all sort of tearing our hair out. And then a group of college students said, we're not going to follow these guidelines. And this happened in Swarthmore, in the Vassar, and in Wesleyan. And they declared themselves an open Hillel and said they're refusing to follow the guidelines that in the Jewish Hillel, you can talk about anything, you can support anything, all voices are welcome, they're not going to be Muslim. And so last weekend at Harvard, they had their first national conference. There were 350 people there. There were incredible, powerful speakers like Judith Butler and Rashid Khalidi, and all sorts of people talking on all, and they weren't all total lefties. I mean, there was some middle to left. And it was very, very empowering. And I think this is a major crack in the armor. With the war on Gaza, it was very disturbing that all these mainstream temples, and this happened in Boston, had these huge Stand With Israel rallies, and they got all the local politicians, and it was really very nationalistic, racist, very disturbing. And a group at Workman's Circle, which is a secular Jewish organization I belong to, you know, we had a rally where we read all 2,000 names of the dead. And it took 2.5 hours. We stood in Park Street, and we were the only Jewish organization, you know, communal organization that said, we're not marching with the Stand With Israel rallies, we're taking a stand that we have to mourn all the dead. Very important thing. Then there were a group of young Jews in New York, and it also spread to Boston, who are religious Jews, who said, we oppose the war in Gaza, and we have to protest it. And so in Boston, we had a rally in front of the building that houses the mainstream Jewish sort of social service funding organizations, the Combined Jewish Philanthropies and the Jewish Community Relations Council. And we said Kaddish, which is a prayer for the dead, and we named the Palestinian dead and the Israeli dead in this very incredible ceremony with all these religious young Jews. I mean, this couldn't have happened 10 years ago. So you see the cracks happening because, you know, Jews as a sort of group of people tend to be liberal-minded. They tend to support unions and workers and women and all that kind of stuff. So, you know, the contradictions are so glaring that people are getting less and less willing to sort of park their politics at the door when they talk about Israel. So I think it's happening. I think the boycott, divestment, sanction movement is the big grassroots thing to be working on. And so that's where we're at right now.
Did you, my voice, there was a Pew survey about people 30 and under. I'm sure you've heard of it. And I just want you to comment on that. And one thing that, see, I'm older and I don't use Twitter that much, but I got on Twitter, and Twitter can change because it's not controlled. So it was a very powerful tool. What did you see? Everything. And then I passed it on to my 20-year-old. She's like, what's Gaza? I said, just look up, you know, war of Gaza. And she's like, now she's so anti-Semitic. So I'm like, well, how do we avoid that too? That's something you could come from.
So I think it's very important to make a distinction between criticism of Israeli policy and anti-Semitism. And there are plenty of anti-Semites that hate Israel. And they hate Israel because Israelis are 80% are Jewish. But it's not anti-Semitic to criticize Israeli policy. And that's something that people are becoming much more public about stating. And you know, it gets very hard because, as I said, Israel says, you know, we are the Jewish, we speak for the Jewish people. So it kind of gets all blurred. But it's really important to make that difference. And it's somewhat anti-Semitic to think that all Jews are like all Israelis. I mean, putting a a sweep like that is anti-Semitic. So you have to be very clear-headed about that distinction, you know. And I think that, as you said, younger people they first of all did not go through the Holocaust. They did not experience the '67 war. They don't have a sort of cultural PTSD, which is part of my community's behavior. And they're much more interested in being consistent about their politics. So that's why I think the younger generation is not willing to just go along with this framing.
So I'm clearly not in the younger generation, but my parents were Holocaust survivors. And I just wanted to also respond to that it's also the case that people whose parents or who themselves have suffered anti-Semitism are outraged that I feel that my parents' memory is being dishonored by what Israel is doing, and that in fact it is anti-Semitic. The Israeli government is anti-Semitic in the kinds of assaults that are being perpetrated in almost the same way that assaults were perpetrated against people like my parents in the name of my parents. The Israeli government is doing that. And I don't know whether people saw that there were 350 Holocaust survivors and descendants of Holocaust survivors who made a statement to that effect that was published in the New York Times. What I feel like is the way to honor Judaism is to work in solidarity with Palestinians.
Other questions or comments?
You mentioned the sort of very high public opinion solidarity within the Israeli community with residents of Israel for the invasion of Gaza, for a lot of these Israeli internal policies. I was wondering, that seems to be a very big obstacle in this. And people are sort of voting along these lines. It seems like it's just more incentive to continue on the policy level. So I'm wondering what you identify as the causes of this, and if you have any ideas for ways out of the line.
So I think, whenever a country goes to war, the citizenry tend to rally. I mean, that's sort of, we see this all over the place. So Israelis aren't any better or worse than anybody. But if you look at sort of the Israeli politics, it started out with besides the Zionist idea of getting rid of all of the indigenous population to have a Jewish state, it also had, a very strong socialist trend. It had a big safety net. It had some things that were very appealing about it. And if you look at how the politics has worked over the decades, it's been moving to the right. And it's interesting to me, if you look at the early Zionists that were debating, there was all this antisemitism and pogroms and all these horrible things and how could Jews be safe, there was a huge debate over whether Zionism was a good idea. Should there be a Jewish state? Should there be a national state? Should there be Uganda? There were huge questions being raised. And if you look at some of the more powerful thinkers, they predicted that if you decided to have a Jewish state and where Jews were privileged, and theoretically there would be only Jews, that it would be a disaster in the long term. Because deciding that one people are privileged over another people, and their rights, and their trauma, and their yearning, and everything is privileged over somebody else, ultimately leads to a very intense racism. And so I think that what's going on right now is a continuation of what happened in decisions by the Zionists who built the country in '48. That 48 is just going on in different forms. And it was predicted, which is really, if you read like Martin Buber, all of this stuff was predicted, and now it's coming to pass. So, I feel in some ways Israel's like, it's drunk and friends don't, and friends got drunk, and it's our responsibility to say enough, because it's dangerous for Jews as well as for Palestinians. It's horrible for Palestinians, but it's also a real problem for the soul of the country. But it comes from this idea of Jewish exceptionalism. And the other big issue is that for centuries, Jews were the victims, they were the outsiders, whatever. And this sense of being the eternal victim is dangerous, particularly when you're no longer the victim. So if you take this claim to victimhood, which ignores everybody else who's been a victim, and then you sort of blend that with the idea of being a chosen people, that God gave you this land, this is a disastrous, toxic combination. And I think that that's what we're seeing, is this toxicity of that combination. It's not a surprise, you know. And it's a very contradictory place. I mean, you can be in Tel Aviv, and it's like being in Northern California. You know, it's like Northern California. And you can also talk to Jews who never see a Palestinian, are not thinking about the occupation, they're worried about getting the kids to daycare and why there's not a good safety net and co-pays for their health insurance or more. That's what people are worried about. So the occupation is like out of sight, out of mind. And then you have, on the other spectrum, these ultra-religious Jews who are in the settlements who believe that God gave us this land and we got to take every bit of it, and that, you know, the Palestinians that they call Arabs are evil. And, it's a whole framing that's disastrous. But the Tel Aviv people say, well, we're held hostage by the settlers. But it's the government that funds the settlement movements, that gives the mortgages, that makes, provides the military, the water and electricity. And, people are electing the government. Now, our country elected George Bush and people that we might not particularly care for, but they do elect them. And so this right-wing swing is, I think, totally predicted from the Nakba, from the 48 decisions, from the decision to make Jews privileged over everybody else. Yes?
I just like to put in a plug for Palestinian doctors after your initial story of the ambulance service in East Jerusalem. I lived in Brazil for 4 months, including the 3 weeks you were there. I got food poisoning on 2 separate occasions, and I had to go to local Palestinian doctors. I went to, actually one was in a clinic and one was a private doctor. They were both excellent. They both cured my abdominal problems very, very quickly. They were lovely people to spend time with. It's not American medicine. My husband had to actually walk the specimen to the laboratory, which was open on Sunday night at 7 o'clock in the evening. And the specimen was in an apricot jam jar, which wouldn't have satisfied everyone. But the results were fantastic and right. I just wanted to add that to your story about and everything else you're saying about the awful effects of the occupation. I completely agree with. Could probably expand on it somewhat, but I just had to say that. Thank you very much.
Could you talk about, I thought about a one-state solution. I want to hear your thoughts on that. Have you ever thought about it?
It's crossed my mind. So the issue is, what is the ultimate look going to be? Is it going to be one state, 2-state, federation, yada, yada, yada. So when I first started doing this work, talking about a 2-state solution was this radical idea that you couldn't mention in temples, and it was like totally crazy. And then the people in the establishments in the US and in Israel realized that if they want to have a Jewish state, they better have a Palestinian state. So then the 2-state solution became sort of normative, and it's now sort of mainstream. And there have been a ton of variations on what it would look like. So the issue is that in '93 with Oslo was sort of the beginning of what people thought was a peace process. There wasn't. And it was also, if you look at the settlement projects, the settlement growth has been unabated since 1967. So you have this sort of fake peace process around the 2-state solution. And you have this continued eating up of land in the West Bank, Palestinian land, by Jewish settlers. And then you have the Israelis declaring that the Jordan Valley is a closed military zone. So, I mean, basically what's left, I urge people who are not familiar with this, the map card, the Palestinians are left with a collection of Bantustanis. It's not a viable country. So for many of us, looking at this and talking with activists in the region, we got a 1-state already. It's a lousy 1-state, but we have a 1-state. And it's a one state with basically an apartheid system. I mean, in the West Bank, there are separate roads for Jewish settlers and Palestinians. Jews live under civilian rule, Palestinians live under military rule. I mean, it's separate. So we've got a one state already. And so the question is, what is the struggle about now? And when I talk to Palestinian activists, they say it's a struggle for human rights. We don't know how many states, it's a federation. We don't know what it's going to look like. But we do know it has to be based on human rights for everyone. So for me, that's what the struggle is about. I'm not thinking, they're going to have to figure out how to divvy this up, but it has to be done with everybody being on an equal playing field. So that's sort of where I'm at on that.
So sorry I missed your talk. Recently, there was a group of American Muslims who went to the Shalom Hartman Institute in Jerusalem. And these are 20 Muslim Americans who were movers and thinkers and leaders and future leaders. And I'm not sure if you're familiar with this Muslim leadership initiative that was headed by Abdullah Antepli, who is a Turkish American. And there was lots of backlash from Muslims who are American who have invested in the BDS movement because it was closed doors. It wasn't exactly private because they were trying to do a sort of peace mission, otherwise these folks, before they went to Shalom Hartman Institute, were thought to be intelligent movers and shakers, and now some of them are getting death threats and getting, yes, and it's become a really serious situation. Now, the second cohort is going this January, and what I'm interested in knowing is about what other Jews feel about the Shalom Hartman Institute, and it's, I guess what the people were upset about was folks thought that these particular Muslim Americans had bought into apartheid, bought into oppression, and are sort of bought into Zionism in a way that is not going to be healthy for anyone.
So I honestly don't know about that institute. Does anyone? The Shalom Hartman Institute, do you know anything? So I don't know what work they're doing. But I think I can sort of address the whole issue of what's called normalization. Like, at this point, do you work with progressive Israelis to try to make things better, or do you say, look, things are so bad, and the peace process has been such a non-process that the focus should be on boycott, divestment, and sanction, and not on pretending that we can move something forward in the current framework. I don't know what this institute is doing, but I suspect that if it's a Jewish institution, then it's not challenging the fundamentals of Jewish privilege and exceptions. I don't know.
Not challenging the fundamentals of Judaism, but also, okay. It seems to, again, the reaction seems to be to Zionism, not Judaism. And so we're upholding Zionism that is seen in a negative light.
So I think the issue is it possible to uphold Zionism and have a just outcome for Palestinians? I think that's what the issue is. And so, again, not knowing what this institute does, so I'm very limited. You can Google it, okay. Everybody's Googling, then you can look on Twitter and see what they say. But I do think that for many of us, the issue is Zionism. The issue is political Zionism as it is practiced. So that's what the issue is, because that then allows everything else to follow. So I think that that's where the discourse must be about. I don't think anyone should ever have death threats, obviously. It's not good behavior. Did you bring it up, or no?
Of course. And I've mentioned it to many Muslims and Jews, and this is just a hot topic. So what ends up happening is, I think that the people think that these Muslim leaders are going to be brainwashed and somehow feel as though that their solution is not going to uphold Palestinians. There is much talk about Jewish-Muslim relations in the U.S. and how Jewish and Muslim leaders in the U.S. are able to help the situation.
So I can speak to that last thing. And this is a real problem in the Jewish community. So if you look at mainstream Jewish organizations, there are certain rules of discourse. So if you support BDS, for instance, you are considered someone who delegitimizes Israel, who someone by definition is an anti-Semite. I mean, there's actually a lot of sort of PR groups and think tanks, and there was a big report put out by the Raud Institute in Tel Aviv that said, if people support BDS, we have to identify them, we have to go after them, we have to name and shame them. There's a real multi-million-dollar push to keep the conversation a particular conversation. And this makes it really, really hard for Christians and Muslims to support BDS because they don't want to lose the friendship of their Jewish brothers and sisters who they just spend 50 years trying to make friends with, So this is actually a huge issue. And I'm actually speaking in a Presbyterian church in Cleveland in 2 weeks. And what they want me to talk about is basically how can we maintain our friendship with American Jews when we just voted to divest our holdings in companies that profit from the occupation. And the problem is that you can't, that mainstream institutions have drawn a line in the sand that if you cross this, then you're not our friends. And that's really problematic. Whereas the Jewish left would be very supportive of that. So it's a big family fight basically going on. And people are seeing the side effects of that. And it's not healthy as far as having a discourse. So maybe one more question. Did you have one? No? Any? Oh, yes, you.
Netanyahu, the last UN address, he put ISIS with Hamas. So what does that mean to your struggle?
Well, first of all, we have an idiot for a leader, but Netanyahu, frames things however he wants to frame them, and it's unrelated to reality. So, but I happen to have such a dislike of the man that it's hard to talk calmly about it. He's a major problem for any movement in any positive direction. And I think it's very important for Jews over and over again to say, he doesn't speak for us, he doesn't speak for us, he doesn't speak for us, and to really call out all the lies that he says. But his framing is a very right-wing, paranoid, racist, anti-Arab. He's very clear that he's not up for a two-state solution. He actually finally said it. He has a very right-wing father that he's trying to please. His brother died in Entebbe. He's got a lot of stuff. And he's a massive problem for any positive work. And he's juggling, the more right-wing factions that he's trying to corral. Because Israel's a parliamentary democracy, maybe. So that you have to have coalitions so that the smaller parties have a lot of power because the bigger parties need their coalition to stay in power. So he's juggling the right wing. He's trying to keep them in power. But no, he gets up and says Hamas is ISIS and ISIS is Hamas. It's not related to reality as far as I can tell. Do I see it in the mainstream? Most U.S. Jews, I think, are way to the left of Netanyahu in the communities, although the institutions, march with the Israeli government. But I think most U.S. Jews don't have any sympathy for Netanyahu. This is our last question.
First off, commend you that we are doing a very wonderful job. And reserve a lot of criticism and thanks. That's the first part. The second part is, in the world, the classical occupation of people, we call it colonization. Then we got another phase of occupation, and that was apartheid in South Africa. And it looks like the Zionist system in Palestine is the combination of the two, both colonization and apartheid combined. So you touch on your point of what do you see the ultimate solution, and you start on the human rights. If the Zionist attitude towards the poor Palestinians who live in occupied Palestine are elected their leaders like Netanyahu, you just described who he is, then how do you foresee that at least the human rights of the Palestinians can start or be real?
So I think, people who analyze the situation see all the elements of colonization and apartheid and a particular flavor going on here. So the question is, how's that going to change? And I think, just like anywhere in the world, people in power are not going to give up their power voluntarily. And if you look at the history, the folks in the region don't seem to be able to figure this out. And it's partly because the US is totally backing the Israeli government. So I think this, again, leads to the fact that change has to come through massive international grassroots organizing. And so that's where the boycott, divestment, sanction movement comes in, because it's a way the whole international community in every location in its own way can have an impact in educating people and changing, sort of tipping the balance so that people begin to understand what's really going on. It's not going to happen from the politicians of the region, and at this point, it's not going to happen with pressure from our government, because we've never been an honest broker, So I think that's why we, in the grassroots, really have a lot of work to do, and that's why I'm so excited about the boycott, divestment, sanction. So thank you very, very much. If anyone's interested in books or the DVD,